He grew up so poor, his own mother sent him to work before he could barely carry weight. By 12, he was locked away for theft, sent to a reform school most people would call a life sentence for a child. He came out of it with maybe the most dangerous right arm baseball has ever seen. And then he did something no pitcher has ever really done since. He started challenging entire teams to beat him. Not just the batter, not just a lineup, whole rosters, whole towns. Sometimes with his own outfielders sitting in the dirt behind him because he didn't think he needed them. He'd walk into a ballpark as a complete stranger and walk out having personally embarrassed every hitter a town could put in front of him for money, for pride, for a bet made an hour before first pitch, in 3 different countries, for almost 20 years. He never confirmed his real age to a single reporter in his entire career, and by the time baseball finally let him in the door, he was already good enough to have been a legend twice over. This is the real story of Satchel Paige, and the parts of it people still argue about. Number 1. The boy nobody expected to matter. He was born Leroy Robert Paige in Mobile, Alabama, sometime around 1906, the 7th of 12 children. His father worked as a gardener. His mother took in washing to help feed a family that size on almost nothing. There was no room in that house for a kid to be anything but useful. So by age 7, Leroy was already working, collecting bottles, shining shoes, carrying bags for travelers at the train station for whatever tips he could squeeze out of them. He wasn't making enough, so he rigged up a system, ropes and poles that let him haul 4 or 5 satchels at once instead of 1 or 2. Somebody on the platform saw him weighed down under all that luggage and said he looked like a walking satchel tree. The name stuck before he was even a teenager, and he reportedly hated it at first. It didn't matter. Leroy Paige was gone. Satchel Paige had already arrived, years before he'd ever thrown a professional pitch. The trouble started early too. Skip school, small-time theft, the kind of pattern that small southern towns in the 19-teens dealt with by removing the kid entirely. 2 weeks before his 12th birthday, he was arrested and sent to the Alabama Reform School for Juvenile Negro Lawbreakers, a sentence that would keep him away from home for the next 5.5 years. By almost any measure, that should have been the end of his story before it started. Instead, it was the beginning of the only one that mattered. Number 2. The place that was supposed to break him built him instead. Inside that reform school, a coach named Edward Bird noticed a tall, lanky kid could throw harder and straighter than anyone around him. Bird worked with him on mechanics, on the high leg kick, on a delivery where his arm would whip around so violently it looked like his hand was practically in the batter's face by release. Some accounts say a different mentor, a reverend at the school, gets credit instead. Either way, something happened inside those walls that never would have happened outside them. Paige himself put it simply later in life. He traded 5 years of freedom to learn how to pitch. He walked out of that reform school around 1923 with almost nothing to his name and one asset nobody else in Mobile had, an arm that seemed built for something bigger than semi-pro ball in Alabama. He started playing for local teams, the Mobile Tigers, a sandlot squad called the Down the Bay Boys, and it was in one of those low-stakes, nobody-watching games that the legend that would define his entire career first showed up. Number 3. The stunt that built 40 years of reputation. The story goes that his infield fell apart behind him. Error after error in a single inning, runners piling up, the bases eventually loaded with 2 outs and Paige standing on the mound getting angrier by the second. The crowd started booing him for a mess his own teammates had made. So he did something no sane pitcher does. But before that, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on future videos like this one, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this. He waved his outfielders in from their positions and told them to sit down in the infield dirt. With no one backing him up, with the tying and go-ahead run standing on base, he struck out the final batter on 3 pitches and walked off like it was nothing. It's the kind of story that sounds too good to be real, and yet it kept happening over and over across his career. In barnstorming games in front of thousands of people, Paige would call his fielders in, sometimes have them sit on the infield grass, and strike batters out with absolutely no defense behind him at all. It wasn't a trick he did once. It became his signature, a way of turning a baseball game into a public dare. Try to touch me. Nobody could. By the time he signed his first professional contract in 1926 with the Chattanooga Black Lookouts, that reputation had already started to travel ahead of him. Number 4. Paid more than the men who wouldn't let him play with them. Paige moved constantly through the 1920s and 30s, always chasing the better paycheck, pitching for the Birmingham Black Barons, then the Pittsburgh Crawfords under a Prohibition-era numbers boss named Gus Greenlee. The Crawfords Greenlee assembled were absurd. Josh Gibson, Cool Papa Bell, Oscar Charleston, Judy Johnson, 4 future Hall of Famers on one roster, and Paige was, by most accounts, the biggest draw of them all. Here's the part that still stings when you sit with it. Major League Baseball had drawn a hard color line, and every one of those players was locked out of it no matter how good they were. But Paige, specifically, became such a box office attraction that white semi-pro teams would pay him personal appearance fees just to pitch a few innings for them on the side, on top of his regular salary. Bach Kendrick, who would later run the Negro Leagues Museum, described it plainly. Entire towns would shut down just to watch him pitch. He was, by some estimates, earning more than plenty of actual major league players of his era, and still, the one league that mattered most on paper wouldn't let him walk through the front door. Number 5. A baseball team built by a dictator with guns on the sideline. In 1937, Paige got an offer he couldn't easily refuse. The Dominican Republic's leader at the time wanted the best Negro Leagues talent money could buy, and he had $30,000 to make it happen. Paige recruited several of his own Crawford's teammates, including Gibson and Cool Papa Bell, and they went south to play for a team funded directly by a regime that treated the outcome as a political statement, not a game. Reports from the time described the American players being watched over by armed guards during their stay. Losing wasn't just embarrassing, it carried real, unspoken risk. Paige's team won the championship anyway, and he personally led the league with an 8-2 record that season. But he came back to the United States having learned something most ball players never have to learn. Sometimes the stakes of a baseball game have nothing to do with baseball at all. His decision to go, without permission, also cost him his relationship with Greenlee, who'd been stripped of his championship roster and sold his contract out from under him in retaliation. Paige refused to report to the team he'd been sold to. He went to Mexico instead. And there, for the first time, his arm actually betrayed him. Number 6. The arm dies and somehow comes back. Playing in Mexico, Paige developed a sore arm serious enough that some around him assumed his career was finished. For a pitcher whose entire identity was built on a blazing fastball, this should have been the quiet, undignified ending so many hard-throwing pitchers eventually get. Instead, he adapted. He leaned into control, into a slower assortment of breaking pitches he gave nicknames like Long Tommy and the hesitation pitch, deliveries designed to disrupt timing rather than simply overpower it. He signed with the Kansas City Monarchs and kept pitching, kept barnstorming, kept drawing crowds well into his 30s, an age where most players in the sport were already retired or coaching. It was during these years that some of his most famous exhibition duels happened, including a legendary matchup against Hall of Famer Dizzy Dean, a game Paige won 1-0 in 13 innings, a performance Bill Veeck, who would later change Paige's life completely, called the best pitching performance he had ever personally witnessed. Dean himself came away saying flatly that Paige was the toughest pitcher he'd ever faced in either league. But that wasn't the whole story of what was coming. Number 7. The insult that never fully healed. In 1945, Brooklyn Dodgers executive Branch Rickey began quietly scouting Negro Leagues talent for an experiment that would break baseball's color line for good. In 1947, he chose Jackie Robinson. Paige, by his own later account, was hurt by that choice in a way he rarely admitted publicly. He'd spent nearly 2 decades being the single biggest reason white ball players wanted to barnstorm against black teams at all. He'd been, in his own words, the one who'd cracked open major league ballparks to black players first, the man who deserved to be first through that particular door. Instead, at around 40 years old, with his best fastball years clearly behind him, he watched a younger man get the chance he'd spent his whole career earning. He never turned that resentment into bitterness toward Robinson himself. He praised him publicly, called him a credit to the game. But the sting of being passed over never fully left him, and it makes what happened 1 year later even more remarkable. Number 8. 42 years old and still not done. On July 7, 1948, Cleveland Indians owner Bill Veeck signed Paige to a major league contract. Officially, he was 42. Some estimates at the time placed him as old as 50. The reaction from baseball's press establishment was brutal. The editor of the Sporting News, the sport's most influential publication, called the signing a publicity stunt and accused Veeck of demeaning the standards of the entire league by fielding a rookie that old. 2 days later, Paige took the mound in relief against the Yankees. He didn't just survive, he thrived. Across the rest of that season, he went 6 wins and 1 loss with a sub-2.5 earned run average, helping push Cleveland into one of the tightest pennant races in American League history, and ultimately a World Series championship. In doing so, he became the first black pitcher to ever appear in a World Series game. Every insult the press had thrown at his signing evaporated in real time, one relief appearance after another. He'd wait 3 more years, sign with the St. Louis Browns under Veeck again, and continue pitching effectively into his mid-40s, a stretch of performance that should have been statistically impossible for a man his age in a sport built on the assumption that a pitcher's arm has an expiration date somewhere around 35. But that pennant race wasn't the last fight Satchel Paige had left in him. There was one more, and it had nothing to do with what he could still do on a mound. Number 9. A Hall of Fame that tried to build him a separate room. By 1971, Paige's Negro Leagues career was widely recognized as Hall of Fame caliber, but there was a problem. Cooperstown's existing rules were built entirely around Major League statistics, and Paige's most dominant seasons had happened in a league the Hall had never formally counted. The solution baseball's commissioner initially proposed was, in hindsight, almost unbelievable. A separate wing, physically apart from the main Hall of Fame gallery, specifically for Negro Leagues players, starting with Paige. When the announcement was made at a press event in New York, reporters immediately zeroed in on exactly what a lot of people were already thinking. Would the plaques even look the same? Would it be treated as equal or as an asterisk with a nicer building around it? The backlash was immediate and loud enough that baseball reversed course before Paige's actual induction ceremony that August. Every Negro Leagues honoree, starting with him, would receive the same plaque in the same hall alongside every other player in the sport's history. In his induction speech, Paige reflected on the strange arc of his own career with a line that's been repeated ever since. Baseball had turned him from a second-class citizen into a second-class immortal, in his words, and then, finally, into simply an immortal. Full stop. He was the first Negro Leagues player ever inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame. Number 10. One last night, age 59, in a rocking chair. By September 1965, Paige hadn't pitched in a major league game in 12 years. He was somewhere around 59 years old, running a bar in Kansas City, mostly out of the public eye. Then Kansas City Athletics owner Charlie Finley, a man never shy about a gimmick, signed him for the final stretch of a lost season, partly as a publicity move and partly, by most accounts, to help Paige quietly qualify for a major league pension that his career had never given him the chance to earn. On September 25, 1965, Finley started him against the Boston Red Sox. Between innings, Paige sat in a rocking chair on the field while the woman dressed as a nurse rubbed liniment oil into his pitching arm. Exactly the kind of theater Finley loved. It looked, on paper, like a stunt designed to embarrass an old man for a headline. Then Paige threw 3 shutout innings, using only 28 pitches, allowing a single hit to a young outfielder named Carl Yastrzemski. In the stands that night sat a 9-year-old boy named Rick Sutcliffe, who would go on to win a Cy Young Award himself, and who has said in interviews that watching Paige walk off that mound to a standing ovation gave him goosebumps for the first time in his life. At 59, give or take, Satchel Paige became the oldest player to ever appear in a Major League Baseball game, a record that still stands. He'd spent his entire career being told, one way or another, that he was too something. Too old, too black, too much of a risk, too much of a joke. That night, in front of a half-empty stadium in Kansas City, none of it applied anymore. He just pitched. He died in June 1982 in the same city where he'd taken his final bow. What he left behind wasn't just a stat line, though the stat line alone is absurd for a man who didn't get his official major league debut until 42. It was a philosophy he'd repeated for decades, eventually published as his own rules for staying young. Skip the fried food, keep moving gently instead of running yourself ragged, go easy on the vices, and the line that outlived every headline written about him: age is a question of mind over matter, and if you don't mind, it doesn't matter. He never did confirm exactly how old he really was. Maybe that was the point all along. A man who spent his whole life daring entire teams to try to get him out never saw much reason to let a number do what a lineup full of major league hitters couldn't. If this story moved you, hit the like button. Drop a comment with the player you wish more people talked about. Paige, Gibson, Cool Papa Bell. We'll read every one of them. And subscribe, because the next legend we're covering fought just as hard to get his shot and never got the ending Paige did. Until then, keep swinging.